Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's WillE. Picking your class is definitely a tough thing to do. With so much to know and learn, it can all be quite daunting, especially when you can easily invest dozens of hours into a class and then just come to realise that you would rather be something different. But there may be something else which you haven't thought of yet. What race is best suited for you? There are many reasons to pick or not pick a race, and since you are going to have this character in front of you for many hours, it's important you pick something you like. Running animations, combat or spell animations, combat noises, racial mounts, starting zones, and of course racial abilities. All these can be a reason for or against picking a particular race. I'm going to look back at each race and give you an overview of what they can bring to the table, as well as their strengths when combined with certain classes, as well as some potential things which may bug you. Let's start with Alliance. Sharing a starting zone with the Dwarves in Dunmorrow, the Gnomes are portrayed as clever and industrious. Their racial mount is the Meccano Strider, and they have the highest base intellect in the game. Gnome racials are quite interesting overall. They have a resistance to arcane damage and a passive 15 boost to engineering, and this profession is one of the most useful for combat in both PvE and PvP, so a small boost to this is a nice head start for the gnome. Better than this maybe, they have Escape Artists, removing any root or slow on a low 1 minute cooldown. This makes gnomes a good candidate for warriors or rogues who want to PvP a lot, as one of your biggest issues are facing mages, and this ratio gives you a better chance versus the likes of Frost Nova and Cone of Cold. The best thing about gnomes, however, is Expansive Mind. This is a 5% increase to intellect, and this scales very well throughout Classic, giving you extra mana and spell critical strike chance, making gnomes the top choice for both warlocks and mages on Alliance. Problems that you may have with gnomes are, well, they're tiny, their field of view is just lower than it is on other characters, and you might find it a bit annoying. Secondly, since they're so small, they don't really show armour off as well as other races. I may as well start doing this from shortest to tallest, which will bring dwarves up next. Slightly taller and a lot wider than gnomes. As mentioned earlier, they also start in Dunmorrow, sitting outside of Ironforge. Two words describe dwarves best: beer and beards. Their racial mount is the ram, and they start with the highest base stamina. They had a passive extra 10 resistance to frost, which was definitely more frequently encountered than arcane. Dwarves had a toggleable ability to find treasure, which would make interactable crates, chests, boxes, etc. appear as a yellow dot on the minimap, which could help you spot the occasional bit of loot while questing. A nice flavour touch for the dwarves there. Their gun skill was increased by 5, which was better than it sounds at endgame, since weapon skill that goes over the cap continues to contribute extra towards your damage. However, guns were rarely the top tier weapon, so from a min-max point of view, it's not really a super large selling point. Dwarves had Stone Form, which increased their armour by 10%, removed, and made you immune to poisons, bleeds, and diseases for 8 seconds. Very strong in PvP, especially against rogues. Also had some uses in PvE as an extra defensive cooldown. Finally, a special note for priests. Dwarves had Fear Ward. This spell alone makes the dwarf a top tier choice for priests. It had many uses in PvE and PvP and should be a strong consideration if you are rolling an Alliance priest. Problem-wise, well, again, they're quite short, not as bad as gnomes though, and they do have this sort of weird spinny attack for 1- and 2-handed weapons. Maybe it's just me, I'm not a huge fan of it. Next up is the human, most likely going to be the most popular Alliance race, and there's many reasons for that. The human mount is a horse, and they start in Elwyn Forest, just outside of Stormwind. Humans have a balanced stat template, almost even across the board. No passive resistances for humans, but they made up for it. The human spirit gives 5% extra spirit passively, which scaled up nicely for healers, especially holy priests, whose healing scaled up with spirit. They had diplomacy, gaining 10% extra bonus reputation, which was actually pretty good, ideal for completionists and those looking to farm up reputation with battlegrounds for their rewards or the mounts. Next up, humans' biggest selling point, their weapon skill increases. 5 extra weapon skill to 1- and 2-handed swords and maces. This made them the top candidate for warriors, rogues, and paladins. As mentioned earlier, weapon skill going beyond the cap is very good, especially for rogues and warriors, as they both had talents that scaled strongly with swords, adding a nice bit to their DPS at endgame. Finally, they have an on-use racial too, Perception, increasing their stealth detection a bit. It has pretty niche uses like detecting stealth mobs while questing or covering a flag carrier in Warsong Gulch. It's okay. And finally, Night Elves. These guys must be like 7 foot tall or something. I mean, just look at them standing next to a human. Straight out of Darnassus, elves are all about trees and nature and trees. Starting in Teldrassil, the racial mount is the Night Saber, and for me this is the best racial mount easily, Horde or Alliance. And Night Elves have the highest base agility. The racials, however, aren't too exciting. Resistance to nature's good enough, extra move speed while dead isn't really something you should be relying on frequently in my opinion. Shadow Meld isn't nearly as useful as it is on retail, it can only be used out of combat, but it is the best racial for hiding from gankers or going to get a drink though. Also, Night Elf Rogues and Druids stealth is massively better thanks to Shadow Meld. 1% extra dodge is okay for melee classes, it's not too great overall, nothing to really highlight here for me. All that being said, Night Elves were definitely the best alliance race for Druids, without a doubt. I personally don't really have any issues with the Night Elves. I like their animation, the starting zone, the music. It's all good for me. So now let's move on to the races with back problems. Sorry, I mean Horde races, of course. Let's do shortest to tallest again. Why not? Undead, former servant of the Lich King, now led by a Banshee Queen. All this lore stuff went way over my head back in vanilla, but with a bit more perspective now, it's pretty interesting stuff. Undead start in Tirisfal Glade and their racial mount is a skeletal warhorse. Undead have the highest base spirit in the game. They must be feeling pretty good about getting resurrected from the dead, I guess. The racials for Undead are super strong across the board. Passive shadow resistance is really nice. It's one of the most common sources of magic throughout Azeroth. They gain 300% breathing capacity. Apparently they aren't undead enough to drown eventually. Go figure. This is actually quite a nice racial on underwater quests if you want a warlock and don't have access to water breathing. Cannibalize is okay too, saves a bit of food, it lets you have another source of in-combat healing, and it certainly has its uses to be sure. It can be nice when you CC one target and then just eat another and bandage up, some pretty good healing. And finally, the big talent, the one that Undead are really recognised for, WillE of the Forsaken. There's no other way to put it, and this talent is amazing. Makes your character immune to fear, charm and sleep effect for 5 seconds, and it also could be used whilst under the effect of any of those abilities. You want to know the best thing though? It doesn't share a cooldown with the PvP trinket. This alone makes Undead a good choices for rogues, mages, warlocks and priests. Even argue warrior, I guess, but they have their own way to break those effects through Berserker Rage anyway. Want to know another fun fact? WillE of the Forsaken used to make you immune for 20 seconds before patch 1.6, so imagine that. Problems with Undead are the bones sticking out through the armour. It's just not a great look, I'm not a fan personally. Orcs. Zug Zug. Starting in the Valley of Trials, these guys know it's not easy being green. Orcs stat template is divided up between stamina, strength and spirit. Makes sense for the lore and the whole, orc traditions of honour and all that. Their racial mount is a wolf. Orcs had some really great racial abilities and some underrated ones at that. First of all, an extra 5 to 1 and 2-handed axes made them the top choice for a warrior for the exact same reason as humans were on the Alliance side. The only difference between orc and human is, with an orc you need to make sure you're equipping an axe to get the benefit. Command allowed extra damage from pets. This tended not to be such a big deal for warlocks whose pets were often just there for utility, threat or sacrifice, but it was definitely a nice bonus for hunters. Blood Fury, another big selling point once again for warriors and rogues. Keep in mind this only increased base attack power, so it didn't scale. It's very good all the same though, especially when paired up with cooldowns like Recklessness and Death Wish. It made you a DPS machine, but really had to watch your threat then. Finally, Hardiness, and honestly this talent is insane. Has more frequent uses in PvP for sure, but tanks in Classic often get hit by many stuns. It's got its uses everywhere. The base chance to resist a stun was 5%. Add 25 on top, you've got nearly a 1 in 3 chance to resist a stun. There was also a talent to get another 15% too. This made rogues avoid orcs like the plague. Orcs were without a doubt the best warriors for hordes, and good picks for every single other class they could be. Hardiness OE. And honestly, you could argue Hardiness is better than WillE of the Forsaken for PvP as well in my opinion. After all, Alliance has 2 classes that can fear, Warlock and Priest, versus 4 classes that have stuns, Rogues, Warriors, Druids and Paladins. If you resisted a Hammer of Justice, that's just game over for the Paladin in an instant really. Issues with Orcs, nothing to say really, depends how much you like your shoulder pads taking up half your screen. I'm a big fan of it personally. If they actually stood up straight, I'd probably be covering them last, but here we are, Trolls. They share a starting zone with Orcs in the Valley of Trials. Once again, their stat template is pretty evenly divided out, and their racial mount is the Raptor. Trolls have some good racials and some not so good racials. Let's start off on the not so good end. Throwing specialization. The only time you're using a thrown weapon is to pull a mob or finish one off when it's on really low health. 9 times out of 10, it doesn't matter whether it hits or not, it's not a big deal. Your health regeneration increased by 10%. The base amount for this is already low. 10% isn't really adding that much on for you. It will save you eating a few times. It's not sort of like this crazy benefit though. Now, onto the good stuff. Bow specialization giving 5 extra skill to bows. There are plenty of good bows to pick up. This makes you more accurate, good for leveling and endgame. Better than the Orc with its stun resist and pet damage and blood fury? Not really though. Berserking, whilst good for leveling or after taking a big hit, it increases haste scaling with health missing, so it can be a pretty decent buff if used at low health levels. Definitely has more uses whilst leveling, can be good in raids too if you can take some damage without dying. Finally, Beast Slaying, a passive 5% extra damage bonus to beasts. This is your best racial ability. Many enemies will be beasts during leveling, and that 5% extra damage will add up over time. Plenty of dungeon and raid bosses are also beasts. Don't overlook this racial, it is top tier. Problems with trolls may include sort of spinny attack animations they have again, and the racial mount. I'm not a fan of raptors, there's just too much tail swinging going on for me. And finally, Thorin, the big beefy boy, starting out in Red Cloud Mesa and then venturing off into the open fields to graze. Levels, sorry. Thorin's racial mount is the Kodo, and they have the highest base strength in the game. And the lowest base intellect. Yep, orcs and trolls are cleverer than this race that's constantly portrayed as wise and knowing. There you go. Taurens are the nature-loving counterpart for Horde to the Alliance Night Elves. Thorin have a solid set of racials. Cultivation allows faster progress through herbalism, which should be a nice moneymaker come classic release, and lets them stay up to date with the highest tier herbs in their zone a lot easier. Nature resistant isn't bad, especially at endgame where a number of fights are gated behind farming nature resist items. Warstomp is a great ability in nearly all scenarios. In PvP it can let you get a quick heal or CC off. In PvP it can buy time for a tank to survive or be healed or just run away. Overall it's really good. Keep in mind though it does have a 0.5 second cast time. And finally, endurance. This one does scale with items, meaning Taurens get a nice extra chunk of stamina. Great for tanks once again. All this means Taurens are pretty good at every class they can be, especially warrior and shaman. Issues for me with Tauren are the mounts. I'm just not a big fan of Kodos, okay? I'm sorry. Also doors. Just doors, man. That's everyone. It's a varied cast. All races have their benefits, some more than others, for sure. I hope you learned a thing or two and this helped you out. Let me know what you're going to be playing below and why. As for me, I'm going to be a gnome warlock. Yeah, really. That engineering perk and the extra intellect are good enough for me. As always, thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.